had a week off. So 2 weeks ago, we did the dating game part one, where we looked at radiometric dating with the exception of carbon-14 dating. A little bit different there, and we saved that to tonight's lesson. I will tell you tonight, like the lesson 2 weeks ago, will be heavy science, but please hang on because the good stuff is right around the corner. So we'll finish dating game part 2 tonight. We then move into creation, curse, and catastrophe, really looking at the creation, the curse because of Adam's sin and the implications of that curse, and then the catastrophe. And we'll be there at least 4 weeks, so at least a month, looking at all of those things. And I really do think that'll be a great time for us. And so again, tonight a little different than what I like, but I think it's needful for us to be ready to give an answer to these things about carbon-14 dating. And maybe, okay, so working definitions tonight, science as always, that's what we're talking about. And then we will talk about carbon-14 dating. We will talk about how carbon is formed, carbon-14, radioactive carbon. We will talk about how it's measured. We'll talk about its half-life. So you'll have a pretty working understanding of radioactive carbon. So science, knowledge about the natural world that is based on facts learned through experiments and observation. So as we talk about carbon-14 dating tonight, as we talk about radioactive carbon dating, you'll see after I give you the initial presentation, I'll ask you, is this scientific? Is this a scientific process based on real science? And I'll let you decide. So we've seen that the Bible teaches a young creation. We really looked at that weeks back, but there we have the snapshot from Genesis, from Adam all the way to Joseph in Egypt, 2,309 years, and from there we carry right all the way to Christ. There's no way from the Bible we get an old creation. The Bible demands a young creation. The Genesis connects easily with Matthew and Luke. Here we have Luke's account going from Adam all the way to Christ in the blue. And then we have Matthew's account going from Abraham all the way to Christ in the purple. Again, we end up with a young creation if we use the genealogies in the Bible, if we use the Bible's timeline for the creation. This is the timeline we've been looking at. Obviously, day one, the big blue planet, the water-covered planet. The flood, 1,656 years later. Genesis is clear on that. And then the law, roughly 2,700 years later. The cross, roughly 4,250 years later. Again, you end up with a creation that's greater than 6,000 years, but clearly less than 7,000 years old, if you believe the Bible. We've talked about this a few weeks. This will be the last week you see this slide. The last time we'll talk about it like this. Science does not produce ages, and you'll see this really like you did 2 weeks ago. You'll see it again tonight. If we push science for ages with radiometric dating methods, with the geologic column, if we push science for ages to get the ages of people or things, we must remember that it has limitations. It can only produce a min, max, or range estimate. Oftentimes we'll be given a range, but it does have a plus or minus built into it. They just leave that part out and produce it as if it were this is the age. Equally, you'll find those plus or minuses often mean nothing. They're totally, as you'll see tonight, they're just arbitrary. It makes assumptions about the past that must hold true for that age, min, max, or range to be reliable. You'll see this tonight more than you did with radiometric dating. You'll see the assumptions that lie behind carbon-14. In theory, carbon-14 dating should work great. The problem is almost all the assumptions are violated. That's what ruins the method. And then finally, as the assumptions are violated, we go from creating a bigger error in the age to making the age completely erroneous and useless. And you'll see as that plays out tonight. So as we've looked at various forms of evidence from creation, we found a great deal of evidence that points to a creation that cannot be 4.5 billion years old. If you remember 2 weeks ago, I did the lightning round and went through 4 or 5 slides of just running things that give an age not even in billions, sometimes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, but again, lots of evidence if we're really wanting to look. What is the evidence of the old creation? We talked about this 2 weeks ago. It is radiometric dating and all its flaws, and it is the geologic column, which has no basis in science. It's completely made up. So we come tonight to carbon-14 dating. So, although scientists differ in the exact number, the oldest age, roughly speaking, you're going to get from a sample before it's completely carbon deplete, radioactive carbon deplete, or we can't measure it any longer, is about 100,000 years old. Now some say 90, some say 120, just roughly 100,000 years old. So that means that as you think about diamonds, coal, natural gas, fossils of dinosaurs, none of those things should turn back a carbon date because they have exceeded the ability, the age of carbon, radioactive carbon, by such a factor that it would be impossible for them to return any date. They would be carbon deplete, radioactive carbon deplete. Second, carbon-14 can only be used to date biological materials. So that's living things. That's plants and animals, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. It cannot be used to date rocks. It cannot be used to date lava flows. You can use other radiometric datings, but not methods, but not carbon-14. So carbon-14, short half-life, creates a short time range that you can get from it, and then equally only biological material. So first, before we discuss carbon-14, I want to provide you an example from the same video clip that I provided you the example from 2 weeks ago about, then it was radiometric backflips. Tonight we'll call it carbon-14 backflips. And at the end of the video, I'll ask you, is this scientific? Did they get to that age scientifically, or did they get there another way completely? So the next video clip, carbon-14 backflips, is from Creation Magazine Live. Again, the speakers are Richard Fangrad, Calvin Smith. We're picking up right where that last video left off because now they're going to talk about carbon-14 backflips.
Our subject today is radiometric backflips. How
You got no audio, brother. You want to try it again? Oh.
Our subject today is radiometric backflips. Our subject today is radiometric backflips. How solid are those dates that we hear about in scientific literature? Let's continue now with another example of radiometric dating methods that are often taught to be absolute fact, which are in fact not at all.
In western New South Wales, that's
in western New South Wales, that's in Australia,
a semi-arid desert,
part of a semi-arid desert has been set aside as a World Heritage Site. Evolutionists believe that the site represents an outstanding example of one of the major stages in man's evolutionary history. It all centers on the discovery of human remains in sand dunes surrounding ancient Lake Mungo. And the first major find in 1969 was of a crushed and burnt skeletal fragments interpreted to be a female called Lake Mungo. Mungo woman. What made the find significant was the assigned date. Carbon-14 dating. Yielded an age of 19,000 years. Collagen, some soft tissue. Collagen, some soft tissue, gave a 24,700.
This excited the archaeologists because these
dates made their find the oldest human burial in Australia.
Carbon-14 dating on nearby charcoal produced an age up to 26,500 years. 26,500 years. This meant that the skeleton,
slightly lower than the charcoal,
buried slightly lower than the charcoal, must have been older.
Surprisingly, the older charcoal age was considered to be the most reliable estimate, and launched a Mungo woman to national and international fame.
It's even older.
This old age. It's even older. So Jane Baum of the Center for Archaeology at the University of Western Australia put it succinctly. There's a general perception that there is a competition to get the oldest date, and there's kudos.
Whoever gets the oldest one wins.
Absolutely. Whoever gets the oldest one wins.
Absolutely. There was kudos in this date. There was kudos in this date at 26,000 years. Mungo woman was nearly twice as old as the previous oldest date for Aboriginal settlement in Australia, and possibly the earliest human cremation in the entire world.
Then in 1974, Bowler and Thorne, researchers found a skeleton sprinkled with powdered red ochre in a grave only 450 meters away.
This one was well
preserved and similar to the skeletons of modern Aborigines. Because the new skeleton, they called it, Lake Mungo 3, was found in the same sand bed, technically the same stratigraphic horizon. He was assigned the same age as Mungo woman.
Mungo man became famous
as one of the world's earliest sites.
the situation became even more exciting.
The situation became even more exciting.
A different dating method,
thermoluminescence
was used. In 1998,
Bowler reported that the
Mungo 3 site gave an age of some 42,000 years. Being older than the carbon-14 dates, Mungo Man acquired a new stature, a new status
on the world evolution scene. So the earlier reliable carbon-14 ages were abandoned in favor of the thermoluminescent states.
So which one was science?
Which one was science?
The thing. Which one, truth.
Then in 1999,
so other scientists from the Australian National University published a new comprehensive study on the age of Mungo Man. They used different samples of bone and sand and a couple of different dating methods. And the results from all the different methods agreed closely. Their conclusion, Mungo Man was 62,000 years old. He's getting older all the time.
There was just one small problem. There was just one small problem. The new date meant that the history of Australian occupation have to be rewritten.
And it also affected the ideas
of human evolution in other parts of the world.
So Bowler stubbornly refused to accept the new dates in his protest of the Journal of Human Evolution.
He said, for this complex laboratory-based dating to be successful, the data must be compatible with the external field evidence.
It's hard not to laugh here, but
you
don't just accept the laboratory date.
You don't just accept the laboratory date without question. That's the moral of the story. It's not the last word on the age of something. You only accept the date if it agrees with what you already think it should be.
That's the moral of the story. That's what we've been saying all along. This is why we won't accept the eyewitness data that contradicts the eyewitness evidence of human Bible. It's the authority. The Bible is the authority. Any of these contradictory dates simply can't be correct.
In short, the dates are wrong because they are based on wrong assumptions.
For example, the carbon-14 method doesn't account for the disruption of carbon balance during the flood some 4,500 years ago. Uranium methods don't make correct assumptions about the initial conditions of the samples or about the effects of changing environmental conditions throughout time. The luminescence dates have the same problem.
Just goes on and on.
Exactly.
Just goes on and on.
Exactly.
Basically, what we're telling Christians here is this.
Don't marry your theology
so-called dating
to these scientific so-called dating methods.
You're going to find out you might get a divorce sooner or later.
You're going to find out you might get a divorce sooner or later. We've seen people who've claimed Christianity reject their faith over these so-called scientific dating methods, but they aren't absolute.
We'll have more. A Mungo Man and Mungo Lady there found in Australia. So again, 1969, human remains were found. It was believed to be a woman, fairly certain. It was burnt skeletal fragments, a crushed skull. They believed it was the first cremation they had ever found that dated this old. And once they dated it, this is interesting, bone material dated 19,000 years, while as you see on the side, collagen dated nearly 25,000 years. Now automatically, that ought to generate well, why do the same bone materials in the same person give ages so radically different than that if carbon-14 dating provides an accurate date? But let's just push on. So 19,000 if you took the bone material, nearly 25,000 if you took the collagen. So then, carbon-14 dating on nearby charcoal produced an age of 26,500. This meant that the skeleton, which was buried slightly below that charcoal level, must be older than 26,500 because that was dated 26,500. So they took the two good dates they had, threw those out for the date of the charcoal and said it's older than that. Next, obviously not surprisingly, that older date was selected as the most reliable date. And Mungo Woman is launched to international fame. And by the way, at 26,000 years, as they said, she's nearly twice as old as the previous Aboriginal they found, and possibly the earliest human cremation that's ever been found on the planet. So things are going well. They're looking good. Lots of publicity. Then in 1974, they find a skeleton sprinkled with red dye material. This is a burial. This one is well preserved. It's 450 meters away from Mungo Woman. So just kind of get that in your mind, nearly 5 football fields away. But because it's in the same sand dune, at roughly the same stratigraphic height, they say it must be the same age as Mungo Woman, and so Mungo Man now jumps to 26,500 years, and oh, by the way, he's the oldest ritual burial site we've ever found. So obviously they are doing great. He launches to fame. If you want to Google Mungo Man, you'll see the big celebration that they had when they brought him back to Australia. So if you're interested in something silly like that. The situation becomes even more exciting, if you like that word, when they use a different dating method, thermoluminescence, in 1998, and they report back that, oh, no, it's not 26,500 years old, it's 42,000 years old. And they get these from new carbon dates, and so they determine that these dates are more reliable than all the other dates they've previously done, and now Mungo Man and Mungo Woman have been launched into absolute fame, much older than anything in Australia that they found to date. Then in 1999, Thorne, a scientist, not to be outdone by the others, and some other scientists working with him, they use a number of different dating methods, and you'll see I list them: ESR, OSL, they use thorium, uranium, and protactinium uranium, and all of these dates give a similar age of 62,000 years old. And so they push hard for this to be the new date for Mungo Man and Mungo Woman. Here's the problem. This will rewrite Australian history if this is so. So there's a big fight on that cannot be the date, and ultimately that date is rejected. But here's my question for us tonight. How old is Mungo Man? Is he 19,000 years old? That was the bone. Is he 24/7? That was the collagen. Is he 26/5? That was the charcoal. Is he 42,000 or is he 62,000?
Less than 7.
Less than 7. Thank you, brother. Right? I mean, this is easy. But now this comes to the question. Is this scientific? Is what you've watched happen with dates here scientific? This is not someone using science to narrow down the best date. These are people getting to a date either they want or that they can live with. And when they get a date they cannot live with, then they reject that even though they had multiple convergence on that date of 62,000. It should have been the best date. Unfortunately, they were going to have to rewrite Australian history and some human evolution history for that one to be the correct date, so that one ended up being rejected. So now let's talk about carbon-14, how it works. So that's the shenanigans that go on with carbon-14 dating. So the Earth's atmosphere, as you maybe don't know, 78% nitrogen, lots of nitrogen, 21% oxygen. This will come up later, by the way, so this is testable. And then 1% of all these other elements. In particular, I want you to see the level of carbon dioxide, 0.06%. So a very small amount of our atmosphere is carbon dioxide. Obviously, carbon dioxide is used by plants during the photosynthesis process. Okay, so that's the Earth's atmosphere. So cosmic rays strike atoms in our upper atmosphere, and they cause the nucleus, or they cause neutron release from many of those atoms. Those excited neutrons then interact with that element in our atmosphere, which there's a whole lot of, nitrogen, and create radioactive carbon, or carbon-14. So carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon that has a half-life, 5,430 years, and it converts back to nitrogen. And so within the atmosphere, this carbon-14 mixes with oxygen and mixes with the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and just becomes a part of the carbon dioxide. Some of the carbon dioxide is radioactive and it's going to decay, and some is just regular carbon dioxide. And so along the way, what happens is the plants take it in, the animals eat the plants, or the animals eat animals that ate the plants. Now, here's the levels. I told you 0.06 in our atmosphere carbon dioxide. Look at the level of radioactive carbon. 0.000076.5. A very, very, very tiny, minuscule amount of our atmosphere is made up of this radioactive carbon in carbon dioxide. And it gets carried all over the place. And then, like we said, the plants are using it in photosynthesis, the animals eat the plants, or the animals eat animals that ate the plants, and that's how they get radioactive carbon in them. That's how the plants get radioactive carbon in them. Pretty easy. So now let's discuss all the assumptions about using this as a dating method. Number one, the assumption is that the level of carbon-14 is at equilibrium. What in the world does that mean? Okay, I'll give you a picture because a picture really explains it. If I took a barrel, men, and drew a bunch of holes up the side and began to pour water in it, the level would begin to rise. And then it would start going out the holes. we would reach a point where it couldn't go any higher because what was going out equal what was coming in, and thus we would say that is at equilibrium. And unless I plug one of the holes or increase the water flow, it's just going to stay at that level. Water coming in, water going out, it's equilibrium. Well, that's the same with the atmosphere. As you might imagine, we would believe it started with no radioactive carbon, and it reaches a point of equilibrium where that's half-life going away equals that's being created. It's at equilibrium. Okay, easy enough. So calculations indicate that it would take 30,000 years for our atmosphere to reach equilibrium. I hope you see a problem, Derek. Right? You just told me his age had to be less than 7. Well, guess what? This would indicate to a Bible-believing Christian, okay, easy enough. Assumption number 1's violated. We're not at equilibrium. The atmosphere, we haven't been here 30,000 years. Dr. Willard Libby, who discovered carbon-14 dating in 1949, found considerable discrepancies in the measurements indicating that apparently radioactive carbon was being created in the atmosphere somewhere around 25% faster than it was going extinct, which would indicate that the atmosphere was out of equilibrium. Since the result was inexplicable by any conventional scientific means, Libby put the discrepancy down as experimental error. Now, why would he do that? Well, I think we all know the answer why we'd do that. 30,000 years to reach equilibrium. The Earth is billions of years old. Therefore, we are at equilibrium, and that must be error. It's just measurement error. I can ignore it. It's not real. It's not just him. This is Richard, I think it's Lingfelter. There's a strong indication that despite the large errors, that the present natural production rate exceeds the natural decay rate by as much as 25%. It's not just him. This is R. Taylor. Radioactive carbon is forming 28 to 37% faster than it is decaying. Guess what? Assumption number 1, that the atmosphere is at equilibrium. Absolutely not. In fact, we have plenty of scientists who don't have a dog in the fight saying it's not at equilibrium. Now, they'll have different ways to try to explain it, but the point is assumption number 1's been violated. Assumption number 2, that the carbon-12 and carbon-14 ratio has always been the same. Because what they do is compare the ratio. So they're expecting, when they look at the radioactive carbon left in the plant or the animal, they compare it to the ratio in nature to determine the age. That's the half-life. So the assumption that the ratio has always been the same. Recent research is showing that this is not nearly as simple as Libby believed. For example, the massive burning of fossil fuels associated with the industrial area released a lot of carbon dioxide that was depleted of radioactive carbon. So when that happened, it gives a much older date to anything you date before the Industrial Revolution. He didn't understand that. We do now. We try to calibrate ages with some of these things now. This causes things dated before the Industrial Revolution to appear much older because of that problem. Assuming that you start with little to no carbon-14 in the atmosphere and it builds from there, taking roughly 30,000 years, guess what? We're not at equilibrium. So the C12 and C14 are not stable. The ratio's not the same yet. So assumption 2 is violated because of point number 1. So what would I say about assumption 2? Violated. Okay, so we're 2 for 2. Number 3, cosmic ray penetration of the Earth's atmosphere in the past is the same as it is today. And you're thinking, that's weird. Stated differently, the rate of production of C14 in our atmosphere has always been this same rate. Now, we already talked about the Industrial Revolution changed it a little bit because it released depleted carbon-14, but that's or carbon-12, but this is here we're talking about carbon-14. So, we know the magnetic field, which blocks cosmic rays from penetrating the atmosphere, is rapidly decreasing in strength. Part of what that magnetic field does is blocks cosmic radiation from penetrating the atmosphere. That fact alone violates assumption number 3. Equally, if the Earth had any type of water or ice canopy at creation, and we'll talk about this during creation and during catastrophe, this would have completely or nearly completely blocked the production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. This would violate assumption number 3 in a massive way. And so I'll just give you a few things, and we'll talk more about these. This is Genesis 1. This is the creation. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide waters from waters. And God made the firmament that divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And He named the firmament heaven. Now, the picture for us seems to be that he divided water from water with a firmament. Some theologians would say that was a water canopy that's being talked about here in Genesis 1. We'll talk more about that. Or we could look at the flood as it happened. Here's how it's described by God in Genesis 7. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. I don't know what you think that means, but that is cataclysmic, plate tectonic destruction of this planet, where the fountains of the deep are broken up. And notice how it describes it next. The windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, maybe windows of heaven and rain are the same thing. Or maybe the windows of heaven are the destruction of the ice or water canopy that we read about in Genesis 1. So did the pre-flood world look something like that? Now, truth in advertising, there are modeling problems with this that overheat the planet. But it still remains a legitimate question, because if it did, then guess what? All bets are off on carbon-14 production before the flood. It could have looked like this. There could have been no carbon-14 production post-flood. And it only started after the flood. And guess what? As we start to puzzle through the ages of things starting to decrease, in particular humans, this starts to answer some of the reason why. Or maybe it looked like that. Or maybe it looked like that. But guess what else we don't know? We don't know what it looked like when all the vegetation on this planet was buried, all the carbon on this planet was buried in the deluge and the destruction that was the flood. You see, we don't have any idea what this chart looks like in reality. And they're treating it like a flat line of 30,000 years old. So, we have no idea the magnitude of the disruption. So all of these items, as well as others, make assumptions 2 and 3 completely untenable, unrealistic, impossible. Assumption number 4, the carbon-14 level in living plants and animals is the same as the atmosphere. Because that's the theory, right? Well, guess what? That's a good theory, one would think, but it turns out, again, Libby didn't realize the complexity in play here that we now do. As you look at my second bullet, we now know that plants are able to discriminate against carbon-14. So somehow some plants are able to reject even taking in radioactive carbon. We don't understand why, and different plants do it to different degrees. But that idea completely destroys it, because now I can eat a plant that has very little radioactive carbon in it, and if it dies and you check it, it had very little radioactive carbon. This point alone overthrows the whole theory. So assumption 4, not tenable. Assumption 5, that the samples are not contaminated. Okay, we'll say that. Any sample you find is not contaminated. Boom, you own assumption 5. And then finally, assumption number 6, that the decay rate has not changed in the past. We assume it hasn't, but we really don't know if there was something in the catastrophe of the flood that even changed the decay rate of radioactive materials. So the truth is, for sure, 4 of the 6 assumptions are untenable. One's we don't know, and the other one we're just going to give away for free. So at this point I'll ask, is this scientific? And I would say the theory seems to be scientific. Unfortunately, the required assumptions make it untenable. It's unrealistic. It does not work in real-world application. This next video is from Evolution's Achilles Heels. You'll hear from Dr. Jim Mason. You'll hear from Dr. Jonathan Sephardi talking about carbon-14 dating.
People think carbon dating can be used to date things that are millions or even billions of years old. Because of its half-life, carbon dating can only be used to date things that are at most a few tens of thousands of years old. Because after that length of time, so much of the carbon-14 is decayed that there's not enough of it left to be detected even with today's modern instruments.
If the whole Earth was pure carbon-14, it could only last about 1 million years before it's all gone and we couldn't detect it. And yet, we repeatedly find carbon-14 in objects which are claimed to be millions and even billions of years old, including diamonds. But the fact that we're finding carbon-14 carbon-14 shows they can't be millions or billions of years old. So carbon-14 is in fact a very strong ally of the biblical timescale and strong evidence against the millions of years of evolution.
What dating of fossils has shown us over time is that there is carbon-14 in the fossil material. This is true whether or not they are fossils of mosasaurs, or fossils of seashells, or fossils of petrified wood, or any of the varieties of fossil fuels that we have, especially coal and oil and natural gas. Samples of these have been analyzed since the 1970s and consistently show us ages that there shouldn't be if they were in fact millions of years old. Coal is a particularly interesting case for carbon-14. Coal is the remains of plants that have been compressed, and so they were part of the ecosystem, had an active connection to carbon-14. It's found globally, and it's found throughout the geological record. When creation scientists sample coal seams from different places and analyze them for the amount of carbon-14, they found that regardless of where they were collected or from what layers of geology they were found, they all registered statistically the same amount of carbon-14. So with the coal seams, rather than providing evidence of gradual deposition and formation of coal over tens or hundreds of millions of years, the identical amounts of carbon-14 in all of the samples that were collected actually shows that they were all buried within the recent past.
Catastrophe that is the global flood. All levels, all seams of coal. So in summary, the dating method does not provide reliable, consistent dates because assumptions are not valid. We lack information about the past to really calibrate the dates. If we had that little carbon-14 graph, we could calibrate the dates and get real dates out of all of it, assuming it was not contaminated. But again, we don't have that. We don't know those levels. So in summary, as they stated, the existence of carbon-14 in everything we date, though, does prove one big point. The fact that it's in diamonds, in fossils, in oil, in natural gas, it's very strong evidence of a young creation, a creation that's thousands of years old, not even millions. Now, sometimes I'll give you a lightning round, just a few examples. Lower leg of this Fairbanks Creek mammoth was dated at 15,380 years, his flesh at 21,300 years. Well, that was, it took a while for the flesh, I guess, to grow there. That was in 1949. That was the year it was invented, so maybe it gets better from here. Living mollusk shells were carbon dated to be 2,300 years old, 1963. This is at a Nobel Symposium. If a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we footnote it. And if it's completely out of date, we just drop it and don't talk about it. Nice. That was 1970. A freshly killed seal was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago, 1971. One part of Dima, we'll talk more about Dima, she was a mammoth. One part dated 40,000 years old, another part dated 26,000 years old, and the wood immediately next to the carcass carbon dated 9,000 to 10,000 years old. 1979. One part of the Valavostok mammoth carbon dated 29,500 years old, another part 44,000 years old. The trouble of radiocarbon dating, this is Robert Lee, the troubles of radiocarbon dating are undeniably deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged, and warnings are out that radiocarbon dating may soon find itself in a crisis situation. Continuing use of the method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach, allowing for contamination here, fractionation there, calibration whenever possible. It should be no surprise then that fully half the dates are rejected. The wonder is, surely, that the remaining half have come to be accepted. He goes on to say, no matter how useful it is, though the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results, there are gross discrepancies. The chronology is uneven and relative. The accepted dates are actually selected dates. This whole blessed thing is nothing more than 13th century alchemy, and it all depends upon which funny paper you read. 1981. 2 Colorado Creek mammoths, 22.8, and the one right next to him, 16.1. I guess it took a while for the second one to die. A geologist at Berkeley's Geochronology Center used the most advanced techniques to date human fossils. A couple years ago, he was reevaluating Homo erectus. Homo erectus is supposed in the evolutionary line of Homo sapiens. We'll talk more about this in the future. He was testing skulls found in 1930 in Java. Again, Homo erectus thought to be about 250,000 years old. He used 2 different dating methods. One returned a date of 53,000 years old, the other 27,000 years old. So here's something that's supposed to be 250,000 years and had been published that way, when dated again, gives a date not even close to that. But it gets even better. Professor Reiner, and if you want to Google his name, you'll see the story, lied about the age of Neanderthal skulls and artifacts for about 30 years. He was exposed by a university panel, and that ended in his resignation. He dated the Bischoff Spire skeleton as 21,300 years. When they retested it, it tested at 3,300 years. Another dating error identified. Same guy, he had dated what was believed to be the oldest human, 27,400 years old. It turned out it belonged to an elderly man who died in 1750. When they opened the cranium to redate this skeleton, they could actually smell it. They could smell the decay. So now you see the point here. The science itself has issues and limitations. The people who are using this science are sometimes simply lying about the results. We'll skip these and get to one more point because I think I'm out of time. So closing observations, the assumptions are not tenable. It seems to work, but what we are missing is a graph of expected carbon-14 levels since creation, and without that, we can't calibrate the dates. And without that, the dates are meaningless. Now, I want to give you some fun info. 2 weeks ago, we talked about a fish called coelacanth, if you were here. I told you he was an index fossil, and it was believed that if you found this index fossil, you were digging in dirt that was roughly 320 million years ago. That was until 1938 when we found one living. We've since found hundreds living. You can buy them on the internet if you want. You can have them at home and put them in your aquarium. The fins on this guy, and I'll show you a picture again of him, are very lobed-like, and they thought he might have been in the evolutionary line of land vertebrates. He was the fish that turned into something that walked on the land. That wasn't until we found them. That wasn't until you could go swimming with them. That wasn't until, and that's the big fin they talked about. But here's the other one. So much for coelacanth. He's not an index fossil, by the way, anymore. The woolly pine. The tree had went extinct from the fossil record 120 million years ago. You can still find this in some textbooks. Has a strange and beautiful leaf. If you Google it, woolly pine, you'll find it. So extinct for 120 million years. That was until 1994. This is a tree, by the way, when we found one in Sydney, Australia. We've since found hundreds in the wild. And you can even go online and buy you a woolly pine that went extinct 120 million years ago and raise it in your backyard. This guy, for reasons I don't understand, has one in his yard, and he has a cage that he keeps around it so nobody will injure his woolly pine. I was thinking, hey, this pine made 120 million years. You don't need to worry about it. You're safe. This tree is safe. Here's my point. Science fails us all the time. Sometimes humans lie to us. God's Word provides us with an absolute trustworthy history of creation that we can rely upon. Thank you.